I drove 15 hours straight just to attend my brother's luxury wedding. But when I finally reached the velvet ropes of the exclusive resort, my own parents blocked the entrance. They looked at me with pure disgust and told me this was an elite event for family members only, and that I needed to go sit in my car and watch it on a live stream. I just smiled, said, "Got it," and drove away. 2 days later, my frantic mother called demanding to know why her card was declining and ordering me to pay a $33,000 bill. I simply laughed and told her the truth. The air was thick with the scent of expensive floral arrangements and ocean salt as I walked up the sweeping cobblestone driveway of the grand estate. I had driven 15 hours straight from a massive corporate audit in Chicago just to be here for Julian today. The string quartet was playing softly in the background, and I could see Courtney's wealthy white relatives mingling on the manicured lawn, holding crystal champagne flutes. I adjusted the collar of my tailored navy suit, feeling the exhaustion of the road, but pushing it down. Before my foot could even touch the marble stairs of the main entrance, my mother Brenda and my father Calvin stepped directly into my path. They moved with a synchronized urgency, completely blocking the heavy oak doors. My mother did not offer a hug or even a basic greeting. Instead, she thrust a crumpled piece of paper with a printed square code directly into my chest. She looked me up and down, her eyes lingering on my simple, unbranded suit with absolute revulsion. She lowered her voice to a harsh whisper, telling me that this was an elite family event, and that Courtney's relatives were high society people who expected a certain level of sophistication. She bluntly stated that me showing up looking like a low-level office worker was going to severely embarrass my brother in front of his new prominent in-laws. She pointed a manicured finger back toward the gravel parking lot and ordered me to go sit in my car, scan the code, and watch the ceremony on the live stream like the rest of the general public. I stood there feeling the cold breeze off the water, wondering how the people who brought me into this world could look at me like I was a contagious disease. I opened my mouth to explain that my firm had just closed a multi-million-dollar acquisition and that my outfit was actually custom-made, but my father, Calvin, aggressively stepped forward to cut me off. He pointed a thick finger at my face and sternly warned me not to cause a massive scene like I did when I selfishly demanded that Julian pay back my college tuition money 5 years ago. The sheer audacity of his statement made my blood run entirely cold. I stared right into my father's eyes and asked him if he was seriously referring to the time Julian stole my financial aid money and drained my bank accounts just to buy a fake Rolex and lease a sports car. Calvin did not even flinch. He aggressively defended his golden boy, claiming that Julian needed those luxury items to look the part for his tech investors, and that siblings are supposed to share their resources to elevate the family name. My mother quickly chimed in, crossing her arms tightly across her chest. She declared that Julian was a wildly successful tech CEO now, and that he was marrying into a highly respected, wealthy white family who could open incredible doors for his future. She sneered at me, saying they absolutely would not let me ruin his perfect day just because I was harboring petty jealousy over his success. Through the glass doors, I could see Julian and Courtney posing for a photographer. Courtney glanced over her shoulder, saw me standing outside with my parents, and let out a condescending laugh before turning her back to me completely. My parents stood shoulder to shoulder, forming an impenetrable wall of toxic devotion to a son who had done nothing but lie and steal his entire life. They were so desperately eager to protect his fragile glass castle that they were willing to treat their own daughter like a stray dog begging for scraps at the back door. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice or beg them to let me inside to celebrate my only brother's wedding. I simply looked at my mother and father with a dead-eyed, chilling smile that made my mother take a small, hesitant step backward. I told them I understood perfectly and told them to enjoy the beautiful wedding. I turned around and walked back down the long cobblestone driveway, my heels clicking rhythmically against the stone. The moment I sat down in the driver's seat of my car, the silence of the cabin wrapped around me. I reached for the ignition, but my phone suddenly vibrated violently in my pocket. The screen lit up with a high-priority federal fraud alert from my personal banking app. I stared at the glowing text in absolute disbelief. My highly restricted Social Security number had just been flagged for a declined transaction of exactly $33,000. The location of the attempted charge was registered to the exact luxury resort I was currently parked outside of. Someone inside that building was actively trying to drain my hidden wealth to pay for this extravagant party. I slowly lowered my phone as a dangerous realization washed over me. They had no idea who they were stealing from today. They had no idea that the daughter they just banished to the parking lot was the absolute last person on earth they should ever try to defraud. 2 long days passed since the humiliating encounter at that exclusive luxury resort. It was a Tuesday morning, and I was sitting in my lavish corner office on the 40th floor in downtown Chicago. The windows offered a panoramic skyline view. I sat behind my mahogany desk reviewing acquisition portfolios. Apex Equity specialized in acquiring toxic debt and investigating commercial fraud. I built this financial empire working agonizing 90-hour weeks to become a leading forensic auditor. To my parents and brother Julian, I was a low-level office drone fetching coffee and struggling to pay rent. They had no idea I owned the entire company or commanded a team of elite investigators. The fraud alert I received in my car 2 days ago had been gnawing at my brain. My Social Security number triggered an alarm for a declined transaction of $33,000 at the exact resort where Julian got married. Before I could initiate a deep trace into the federal database, my private cell phone started buzzing violently. The caller ID flashed my mother, Brenda. I took a slow breath and let it ring 3 times before swiping to answer and placing the device on speakerphone. She skipped any greeting. Brenda was in a state of absolute frantic rage, and her voice was a shrill pitch echoing off the sleek glass walls of my office. She demanded to know why I was not answering faster. She sounded completely out of breath, explaining that the resort management cornered Julian and Courtney in the grand lobby as they were trying to leave for their tropical honeymoon. Julian's wedding payment of $33,000 bounced, and the venue director threatened to call local authorities if the balance was not settled immediately. Brenda stepped in, attempting to swipe her premium credit card to cover her golden boy, but it was aggressively declined in front of the hotel staff. Even worse, it declined right in front of Courtney's wealthy white parents, who watched the humiliating scene. The sheer embarrassment of looking poor in front of her new high society in-laws was tearing my mother apart. She barked a furious order at me, telling me to log into my bank right this second and wire 33 grand directly into Julian's account. She told me to consider the payment my wedding gift since I left without dropping off an envelope of cash. I leaned back in my leather chair and took a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee. I felt my heartbeat remain perfectly steady despite her screaming. I calmly informed her I would not send a single dime to Julian. I told her it was not my responsibility to fund a luxury wedding that I was explicitly banned from attending. The line went silent before Brenda erupted. Her desperation morphed into toxic hatred. She called me a bitter, jealous spinster trying to sabotage her brother's happiness. She screamed I was furious because I was 31 alone and incapable of landing a wealthy spouse. She venomously reminded me that Courtney's family came from old money and Julian was a brilliant tech CEO who hid a minor banking glitch while building his empire. She said I was a miserable nobody who would always be the family burden and I should be begging on my knees to help a brother elevating our family name. Her toxic tirade triggered a visceral memory from college. I remembered the night I discovered Julian stole my business plan and market research to secure a startup loan under a fake company name. When I discovered the theft and confronted my parents begging them to make him stop, Brenda coldly defended him. She told me siblings must share resources, and a man deeply needs a powerful head start in the business world to be respected by peers. Calvin aggressively warned me to keep my mouth shut and stop trying to ruin my brother's momentum. They forced me to swallow the betrayal, silencing me to protect his fragile glass castle. But this situation was not a simple case of sibling rivalry anymore. This was a serious federal crime. While Brenda continued to scream insults, I calmly turned my attention back to my dual monitors. I opened my firm's encrypted federal auditing software. I did not raise my voice to defend my relationship status. Instead, I typed in the partial account details linked to the fraud alert I received 2 days ago. My fingers flew across the keyboard, tracing routing numbers and running them through secure commercial credit databases. I listened to my mother threaten to disown me as I bypassed the privacy walls. The truth began to materialize on my screen in stark black and white data. The credit card Brenda tried to swipe at the resort was not a standard line of personal credit, and it certainly was not registered in her name. It was tied to a ghost company operating out of a registered agent box in a different state. I ran the tax identification number for the shell company, executing a deep forensic trace on the original funding source. I watched the digital paper trail navigate through multiple dummy accounts and offshore routing numbers before leading straight back to a highly secured private trust fund. My heart turned to ice in my chest. The routing numbers perfectly matched the irrevocable trust fund my late grandmother left exclusively for my future. Julian had not just bounced a check to a luxury resort. He had stolen my identity-forged federal banking documents and drained my entire inheritance to fund his fake billionaire lifestyle and his extravagant wedding. The card my mother was holding was directly siphoning my stolen money. I stared at the glowing screen, realizing the immense power I now held in my hands. I let her keep screaming while I opened a new file in my auditing system, preparing to execute a financial maneuver that would legally bring my entire family to their knees. The harsh glow of my dual monitors illuminated the dark corners of my office as I dove deeper into the digital labyrinth Julian had built. My fingers moved rapidly across the keyboard, tracing the routing numbers that had hijacked my grandmother's trust fund. As a forensic auditor, I spend my days dismantling complex corporate fraud schemes, but dismantling my own brother's financial crimes felt entirely different. The ghost company was just the outer layer of a massive rotting onion. I accessed the federal credit databases using my high-level security clearance, and what I found made the air leave my lungs entirely. Julian had not just dipped into the trust fund, he had completely drained it. Every last cent my grandmother had carefully saved for my future was gone. The funds had been liquidated to pay for private jets, custom designer suits, and a $33,000 destination wedding. But Julian did not stop there. The digital paper trail revealed a sprawling web of relentless identity theft that spanned across multiple states. He had used my social security number to open a dozen premium credit lines, maxing them out on luxury car leases and expensive dinners to impress Courtney's high society family. The final blow came when I pulled up the county property records. My heart pounded against my ribs as I stared at the mortgage history for my parents' suburban home. Julian had forged both my parents' signatures and my own as a guarantor to secure 3 separate mortgages on the property. He had leveraged the very roof over their heads to keep his fake tech CEO facade from crumbling. He was drowning in toxic debt, and he had anchored the entire family to his sinking ship. The scale of the deception was breathtaking. He had stolen my identity, erased my inheritance, and secretly mortgaged our parents' future without a single ounce of remorse. The brilliant golden child was nothing more than a prolific fraudster, operating a pathetic Ponzi scheme built on the backs of his own flesh and blood. I sat back in my chair, the silence of the office pressing heavily against my ears as the sheer magnitude of his betrayal washed over me. It was a cold and calculating violation of everything a family should be. Staring at the forged signatures on the digital mortgage deeds, a bitter memory forced its way to the surface. It took me back to my junior year of college, when I had spent 8 agonizing months developing a comprehensive business plan for a financial software startup. I had poured my soul into that project, pulling all-nighters and skipping meals to perfect every detail. Julian was failing out of his business program at the time, but he somehow managed to secure a massive startup loan. It was not until I saw the loan application left carelessly on the kitchen counter that I realized he had copied my entire business plan word for word, changing only the name at the top to his own. When I confronted my parents, tears of frustration streaming down my face, Brenda and Calvin simply rolled their eyes at my distress. My mother had patted Julian on the shoulder and told me to stop being so dramatic because siblings are supposed to share everything. She insisted that Julian needed a strong head start in the corporate world and that I should be proud to support my brother's journey to greatness. My father had angrily warned me not to ruin Julian's momentum over a silly school project, telling me I was being a selfish and ungrateful sister. They had completely validated his theft, teaching him that taking what was mine was not just acceptable, but expected. That toxic enabling had created a monster. They taught him that my boundaries, my hard work, and my property were his to consume whenever he pleased. They fed his delusions of grandeur until he believed the rules of society simply did not apply to him. But stealing a college business plan was a far cry from what I was looking at on my monitors right now. What Julian had done with these credit cards and mortgages was not a simple family dispute over shared resources. This was Class A federal wire fraud, bank fraud, and aggravated identity theft. He had crossed a legal and moral line that my parents could no longer wave away with tired excuses about sibling rivalry. The protective bubble they had built around him was about to shatter, and they were going to be caught directly in the blast zone of his colossal failure. My hand hovered over the phone on my desk. One call to the authorities would send the federal agents straight to Julian's honeymoon suite. But putting him in handcuffs immediately felt entirely too easy. It would not force my parents to confront the reality of the monster they had nurtured all these years. I needed them to feel the exact weight of the destruction he had caused. I closed the federal database and opened the proprietary software for my debt acquisition firm, Apex Equity. Using my corporate authority and available capital, I initiated a series of aggressive legal maneuvers. I contacted the local banks and lending institutions that held Julian's defaulted credit lines and the toxic mortgages on my parents' home. Within hours, I purchased every single piece of debt Julian had created, buying the portfolios for pennies on the dollar through my corporate accounts. I did not call the police or alert the federal authorities just yet. Instead, I made a calculated, lethal move that would change the power dynamic of my family forever. By the time the sun came up over the Chicago skyline, the legal transfers were complete and the contracts were finalized. I was now officially and legally my family's absolute sole creditor. My desktop phone barely had time to cool down before it started ringing again. This time, it was a text from my father Calvin demanding my immediate presence at their suburban house. His message claimed there was a catastrophic family emergency and that I needed to get there right now to fix the mess I had made. I locked my office doors, took the private elevator down to my car, and drove out to the affluent neighborhood I used to call home. The drive felt surreal knowing what I had just uncovered in the federal database. When I walked through the heavy wooden front doors, I was hit with the sound of hysterical sobbing echoing from the living room. I walked in to find Courtney collapsed on the expensive white linen sofa, burying her tear-stained face into her hands. Her designer luggage was piled up near the entryway, completely useless and abandoned. Julian was pacing back and forth across the hardwood floor, pulling at his hair in a frantic panic. His face was pale, and he looked nothing like the confident groom from the weekend. Before I could even take my coat off, my father Calvin marched right up to me, his face red with bulging veins. He screamed at the top of his lungs, demanding to know why I had spitefully reported fraud to the credit bureaus. He pointed at Courtney and yelled that their luxury honeymoon to the Maldives was completely ruined because every single one of Julian's platinum accounts was entirely frozen. The airline had denied their first-class tickets, and the luxury resort had canceled their overwater bungalow. Calvin accused me of deliberately locking my brother's cards out of pure malicious jealousy because I could not stand seeing him happy. My mother Brenda was rubbing Courtney's back, glaring at me as if I had just committed a violent crime against their family. She told me I was a sick and twisted individual for calling the banks and making up lies about fraud just to ruin an innocent couple's dream vacation. They were all standing there treating Julian like a tragic victim of my supposed bitterness, while the stolen money from my trust fund was actively burning a hole in his pocket. I stood perfectly still in the center of their pristine living room, letting Calvin's screaming wash right over me. I did not let their toxic anger penetrate my calm exterior. When he finally ran out of breath, I looked directly at Julian, who suddenly stopped pacing and avoided my gaze. I did not raise my voice, but the cold authority in my tone made the room drop 10 degrees. I looked at my parents and plainly stated that I did not just report random fraud. I told them their brilliant tech CEO son had stolen my identity, opened multiple ghost accounts in my name, and entirely drained the irrevocable trust fund that my grandmother left for my future. I detailed exactly how he had used a shell company to siphon the wealth that was legally mine just to pay for his luxury cars and this ridiculous wedding. I watched the color completely drain from Julian's face as he realized I knew exactly what he had done. But he recovered his golden boy facade almost instantly. He immediately puffed out his chest and blatantly lied straight to our parents' faces. Julian raised his voice and declared that I was having a psychotic break and making up insane delusions to extort money from his successful business. He claimed he had never touched my accounts and that his wealth was entirely self-made through his brilliant tech investments. Before I could even respond, Courtney suddenly jumped up from the sofa, her tears magically vanishing as pure arrogance took over. She marched right up to my face and began berating me with absolute disgust. She called me a pathetic, low-class amateur who was desperately trying to steal from her incredibly successful husband. She sneered at my clothes again, telling me that I was nothing but a jealous spinster office worker trying to hold a real man back because my own life was a miserable failure. Courtney aggressively poked my shoulder and warned me that her wealthy parents had powerful lawyers who would happily sue me into oblivion for defaming Julian's pristine reputation. She told me I was a family disgrace who needed to get on my knees and beg for their forgiveness for ruining their honeymoon. She boasted that her family paid for half the wedding, and she would not let a bitter nobody ruin the other half. I looked down at Courtney's manicured finger still pressing into my shoulder, and then I looked back at my brother who was sweating visibly under his expensive suit. The desperation in his eyes was obvious, but his ego would not let him back down in front of his new wife. I calmly asked Julian how he planned to explain the forged mortgage documents currently placed on our parents' house. I waited for the realization to hit my parents that their own home was leveraged in his scam. Instead of looking guilty, Julian reached inside his tailored jacket and pulled out a heavily creased legal document. He slammed the papers down onto the glass coffee table with a triumphant smirk. Julian arrogantly announced that he did not steal a single penny from my trust fund because I had willingly signed it all over to him. He pointed to a heavily forged signature at the bottom of the page, claiming I had legally surrendered my entire inheritance to him 3 years ago to help fund his tech startup. It was a completely fabricated document, a blatant piece of criminal forgery that would never hold up in a real court. But before I could even state that fact, my mother and father stepped forward to stand right beside him. Brenda looked me dead in the eye and shamelessly stated that she and Calvin had personally witnessed me sign that document. My father nodded, crossing his arms and firmly agreeing that I had voluntarily given Julian the money out of sisterly duty. They were actively participating in his federal crimes, completely willing to lie and commit perjury just to protect his fake empire from collapsing. The suffocating silence in the pristine living room was broken by the sharp metallic click of a gold fountain pen. Courtney marched across the expensive Persian rug and shoved the heavy pen directly into my chest right over my heart. Her eyes were wild and desperate, but she masked her mounting panic with pure, unadulterated entitlement. She shoved the pen closer, demanding that I sit down at the glass coffee table and draft a formal bank retraction immediately. She ordered me to write a federal statement claiming the fraud alert was a massive misunderstanding and that Julian had full authorization to use my restricted accounts. Courtney paced around me like a caged animal, her voice dripping with venomous pride as she boasted about her elite upbringing. She proudly announced that her wealthy family had graciously paid for exactly half of their $500,000 wedding, because that is what high society families do to maintain their flawless image. She screamed that her parents had funded the exotic floral arrangements, the string quartets, the imported catering, and the endless rivers of vintage champagne. She aggressively stepped into my personal space and warned me that if I ruined Julian's half of the wedding expenses, she would personally make it her life's mission to destroy me entirely. She bragged that her father's legal team consisted of the most ruthless corporate sharks in Chicago, and they would happily drag me through a brutal and public defamation lawsuit. She told me they would drown me in endless litigation until I was begging on the streets with nothing left to my name. Courtney sneered and called me a pathetic, low-class amateur who was desperately trying to play a high-stakes financial game I could not possibly understand. She shoved the pen against my collarbone one last time, commanding me to sign my name and fix her perfect honeymoon before her wealthy parents realized they had married their daughter into a family of embarrassing frauds. The pure arrogance radiating from her was suffocating, but it only fueled the cold, analytical clarity settling over my mind. I did not take the gold pen. I let it fall to the floor where it rolled uselessly against the sleek metal leg of the glass table. I looked Courtney up and down with utter chilling contempt, taking in every inch of her stolen luxury. I looked at her heavy diamond earrings, her pristine silk designer blouse, and her perfectly manicured hands shaking with rage. I stared right into her eyes and asked her calmly if she had any idea how Julian actually paid for the brand new white Porsche sitting out in the circular driveway. I watched her arrogant smirk falter for a fraction of a second as confusion bled into her anger. I told her that the massive down payment for her beautiful luxury sports car came directly from a predatory commercial loan taken out against my parents' own retirement account. I told her that the massive monthly lease payments were being systematically drained from a ghost account fueled entirely by my stolen identity. I wanted her to know that her perfect, wealthy husband was nothing but a hollow shell living entirely on stolen time and stolen money. The brutal truth hit her like a physical blow, but instead of facing the sickening reality of her husband, she chose to attack the messenger. Courtney raised her hand and viciously slapped me across the face. The sharp crack of her palm against my cheek echoed loudly through the entire house, silencing everyone. My head snapped to the side and a sharp, stinging heat radiated across my skin. I stood perfectly still, waiting for my parents to intervene. I waited for my father to pull her back, or my mother to scream in my defense. Instead, the silence that followed the physical assault was the most deafening sound I had ever heard. Brenda and Calvin did absolutely nothing to defend their own daughter. They stood shoulder to shoulder with Julian, forming an impenetrable wall of toxic devotion. Calvin pointed a trembling finger at the floor and demanded that I get on my knees right now and apologize to Courtney for insulting her marriage. Brenda crossed her arms tightly and coldly agreed, telling me that my vicious lies had provoked her daughter-in-law and that I deserved the slap for being so aggressively jealous. They demanded I swallow my pride. They demanded I beg for forgiveness. They demanded I sign the federal retraction to save the family name. They demanded I bleed myself dry so Julian could keep wearing his stolen crown. I did not fall to my knees. I did not shed a single tear for the family I was officially losing forever. I slowly raised my hand and wiped my burning cheek, feeling the heat of the slap fading into absolute icy resolve. The pain grounded me, anchoring me to the reality that these people were entirely dead to me now. I looked at my mother, my father, my brother, and his violent wife, and I simply smiled. It was a dead-eyed, chilling smile that made Julian take a slow, hesitant step backward toward the fireplace. I reached into the deep pocket of my tailored navy suit and pulled out a small silver USB drive. I held it up for a brief second before letting it drop from my fingers. It hit the glass coffee table with a sharp, definitive clack that sounded like a final judgment echoing in a courtroom. I looked directly at Courtney and told her that Julian's real, unedited banking statements were on that drive. I told her every forged document, every defaulted loan, and every stolen transfer was sitting right there, waiting for her high society lawyers to read. I turned around without another word. I told them to enjoy their honeymoon, walked out the front doors, and slammed them shut behind me. The heavy thud of the mahogany doors slamming shut echoed behind me as I walked down the pristine driveway of my parents' estate. The crisp evening air felt like a physical weight lifting off my shoulders. I did not look back. Stepping into my car, I allowed myself exactly 1 minute of silence before turning the key and driving back to downtown Chicago. The slap on my cheek still stung, but it only sharpened my focus. They wanted a war of attrition, and I was holding all the ammunition. Back in my office, the city lights glittering through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I sat at my desk and opened the Apex Equity Secure Network. It was time to initiate the aggressive debt collection protocols I had prepped earlier. My parents had foolishly claimed they witnessed me sign over my inheritance, giving Julian's fraudulent document a veneer of legitimacy in their arrogant minds. But in the world of high-stakes finance, their eagerness to protect their golden boy had a fatal flaw. I pulled up the commercial loan guarantees Julian had used to secure his lavish lifestyle. Their signatures were all over his fraudulent agreements, acting as blind guarantors to a mountain of toxic debt. By publicly aligning themselves with his forgery and co-signing his bloated credit lines, they legally tied their own retirement and assets to his massive financial crater. My fingers flew across the keyboard as I systematically activated the maximum collection clauses on every single loan portfolio Apex Equity had just acquired. I filed the emergency freezing orders through the automated banking channels, citing severe default and an immediate flight risk of capital. The banking algorithms did their work instantly without prejudice or emotion. Within seconds, digital locks slammed shut on Calvin and Brenda's joint checking accounts, their pristine mutual funds, and the premium credit cards they used to fund their affluent suburban lifestyle. I watched the status bars turn from green to red across my dual monitors, confirming that my parents were now completely cut off from every dime they possessed. It was an entirely legal financial maneuver executed with absolute corporate precision. They had enabled a thief for years, and now they would share the crushing weight of his poverty. The fallout did not take long to materialize. Less than 48 hours later, my private cell phone buzzed violently across my mahogany desk. The caller ID flashed Brenda. I took a slow sip of my black coffee, letting it ring 3 times, just as I had before swiping to answer and putting her on speakerphone. The sound of frantic public humiliation instantly filled my quiet office. Brenda was screaming at me from the checkout line of an upscale organic grocery store. The background noise was chaotic, with cashiers paging managers and customers murmuring impatiently in the background. My mother was in a state of absolute hyperventilating panic, shrieking that her premium platinum card had just been violently declined for a $400 grocery bill. She yelled that the teenage cashier had embarrassed her in front of half the neighborhood, and that when she tried to use her backup debit card, the machine swallowed it entirely. She demanded to know what kind of sick, vindictive trick I was playing, because the bank representative on the phone had told her a firm called Apex Equity had frozen all their family assets pending a fraud investigation. She was crying real tears now, begging me to fix whatever computer glitch I had caused so she could pay for her imported wines and organic produce. I leaned back in my leather chair, staring at the skyline, and replied with ice-cold indifference. I calmly reminded her of the moment she stood in her living room and demanded I swallow my pride when Julian stole my entire grandmother's trust fund. I asked her why she was screaming over a cart full of vegetables when she did not care at all when my life savings were illegally frozen and drained to buy Courtney's luxury sports car. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy with sudden, terrifying realization. I told her that actions have consequences, and that protecting a fraudster means accepting his debts. She started to stammer out a defense, falling back on her favorite refrain about family loyalty, but I simply pressed the end call button, cutting off her desperate pleas mid-sentence. The memory of my parents enabling Julian flashed through my mind again. They had always prioritized his comfort over my survival, treating my hard work as a communal resource for his benefit. When I had nothing, they told me to work harder. When he had nothing, they let him steal from me. Now the scales were permanently balanced, and I felt absolutely nothing but clinical satisfaction. The final piece of the trap snapped shut the following morning. Julian had been desperately trying to untangle his frozen accounts, completely unaware of the invisible net I had thrown over his life. My phone rang again, but this time it was my brother. I answered silently, letting him speak first. Julian's voice was high-pitched and trembling with raw, unadulterated terror. He told me he had just received a formal notice of foreclosure delivered via certified courier straight to his luxury apartment. He was hyperventilating as he read the letterhead Apex Equity. He had absolutely no idea that I owned the massive debt acquisition firm that was systematically destroying him. He was completely oblivious to the fact that the invisible corporate entity hunting him down was his own sister. Julian begged me to help him, crying that he was about to lose the house, the leased cars, and Courtney's respect entirely. Cornered and completely desperate, he ordered me to sell my car and drain whatever savings I had left so he could hire a top-tier defense lawyer to fight Apex Equity. He actually demanded that I bankrupt myself to protect him from his own crimes. Julian's desperate demand that I sell my car to pay for his defense lawyer was the absolute pinnacle of his delusion. I had hung up the phone without giving him a single word of comfort, letting the crushing silence be his only answer. But my family had never understood boundaries, and they certainly did not understand the concept of defeat. Less than an hour later, the polished serenity of my corporate lobby was violently shattered. I was reviewing quarterly liquidation reports in my corner office when my security chief radioed up to tell me there was a hostile disturbance on the ground floor. My parents and Julian had stormed into the gleaming marble lobby of the downtown high-rise, fully believing they were walking into the mundane workplace of a low-level clerk. They marched right up to the front desk and began causing a massive, embarrassing scene in front of dozens of high-profile clients and industry professionals. Calvin was red in the face, pounding his fist against the imported stone counter, demanding that the receptionist call down his ungrateful daughter immediately. He shouted that I was a pathetic paper pusher who needed to be dragged out of my cubicle to face my family. Brenda was standing right behind him, clutching her useless designer handbag and wailing hysterically about her declined credit cards, making a spectacle of her own public humiliation. She wailed to anyone who would listen that her own flesh and blood was a spiteful spinster trying to ruin her golden boy's life. Julian was the loudest of them all, pacing the lobby floor and screaming that he needed to speak to my manager. He yelled that I had lost my mind and was trying to sabotage his tech empire by refusing to bail him out of a simple misunderstanding. He demanded that the firm fire me on the spot for insubordination and family treason. They were completely unhinged, throwing a collective tantrum in the middle of a billion-dollar financial institution. They thought they could just barge into my workplace and bully me into submission exactly the way they had done in our living room for my entire life. Their sheer entitlement blinded them to the reality of their surroundings. They did not notice the armed security personnel closing in or the hushed whispers of the executives walking past them. They only saw what they wanted to see, a stage for their toxic family drama. The receptionist remained perfectly calm and signaled for the head of security. 3 broad-shouldered guards dressed in immaculate dark suits quickly moved in to physically eject my family from the premises. Calvin began swinging his arms wildly, threatening to sue the building, while Brenda shrieked that they were being assaulted. Julian tried to shove past one of the guards, screaming my name and demanding that I stop hiding like a coward. Just as the head of security grabbed Calvin's shoulder to physically force him through the revolving glass doors, a soft chime echoed through the cavernous lobby. The heavy, brushed steel doors of the private executive elevator slid open. The chaotic screaming abruptly died down as every eye in the lobby turned toward the sound. I stepped out of the elevator wearing a bespoke midnight blue silk suit that cost more than Julian's fake destination wedding. My posture was absolute cold authority. Trailing half a step behind me was my senior executive assistant holding a tablet and rapidly reading off the morning's multi-million-dollar acquisition reports. She briefed me loudly on the aggressive liquidation of 3 hostile portfolios, detailing the exact millions we had just seized from defaulted accounts, and asked for my final authorization to completely dismantle a rival firm. I gave the order without breaking my stride, projecting the terrifying reality of a woman who commanded an empire. The silence that fell over my family was absolute and suffocating. Brenda's jaw literally dropped open, her hysterical tears drying up instantly as she stared at the impeccable tailoring of my clothes and the sheer power radiating from my every movement. Calvin stood frozen, his raised fist slowly dropping to his side as his brain struggled to process the impossible sight in front of him. This was not the quiet, obedient daughter they had bullied and belittled for decades. This was not the jealous, low-class amateur Courtney had slapped in the living room. I was not fetching coffee or pushing paper in some forgotten cubicle. I was walking through a fortress of wealth and power that I had built from the ground up with my own 2 hands while they were busy funding Julian's delusions. The golden child and his enablers were entirely paralyzed by the overwhelming magnitude of their own ignorance. They had spent my entire life viewing me as a stepping stone for my brother's success, entirely failing to realize I was building a mountain they could never climb. I stopped walking and stood perfectly still in the center of the lobby, flanked by my assistant and my security team. I looked at the 3 of them with the same clinical detachment I reserved for a bankrupt ledger. Julian was breathing heavily, his eyes darting frantically around the expansive architectural space as the terrifying reality of his situation began to finally crack his ego. His desperate gaze drifted past my designer suit and slowly tracked upward to the massive wall directly behind the main reception desk. Mounted on the dark marble in giant illuminated brushed steel letters was the corporate logo of the building. Apex Equity. Julian's face drained of all color, turning a sickly shade of ash gray as his eyes locked onto the glowing words. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. It was the exact same name printed on the devastating foreclosure notices currently sitting on his kitchen counter. The ruthless predatory firm that had aggressively bought up every single one of his fraudulent loans, frozen his luxury accounts, and systematically dismantled his entire fake life. In less than 24 hours, was completely and entirely owned by the sister he had just tried to destroy. The realization paralyzed Julian completely. He stared at the brushed steel letters of Apex Equity as if they were written in blood. Before he could stumble backward and run like the coward he was, I nodded to my security chief. The guards stepped aside, forming a clear path to the private glass-walled boardroom just off the main executive lobby. I did not ask them to follow me. I simply turned and walked into the cavernous room, knowing their sheer desperation would drag them right behind me. The heavy glass doors clicked shut, sealing us inside a soundproof chamber of my own design. Calvin, Brenda, and Julian stood awkwardly on the plush carpet, looking entirely out of place, surrounded by panoramic views of the Chicago skyline. I walked to the head of the massive mahogany table and picked up a thick leather-bound folder. Without a word, I opened it and threw a stack of legally binding defaulted debt contracts across the polished wood. The heavy parchment slid directly to a stop in front of my father. I looked at the 3 of them and officially declared myself their absolute creditor. I explained in painstaking detail that Apex Equity now owned every single predatory loan Julian had fraudulently secured, and because my parents had foolishly co-signed his toxic debts, I now legally owned them too. I owned their retirement funds, I owned their house, and I owned every asset they had spent decades bragging about. The pristine silence of the boardroom was shattered when Calvin finally snapped out of his shock. His face turned a violent shade of crimson, and he exploded in a terrifying rage. He slammed his hands against the back of a leather chair, demanding that I immediately tear up the contracts and fulfill my duty as a daughter to save this family from financial ruin. He yelled, "That family protects family, and that I was morally obligated to use my corporate power to wipe Julian's slate clean before the authorities got involved." He insisted that I owed them my respect and that my corporate success was meaningless if I allowed my own brother to face federal prison. I did not flinch at his screaming. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the cool mahogany table, and stared at the man who had always treated me like an unwanted burden. Calvin slammed his fist down on the table so hard the glass water pitchers rattled. He pointed a shaking finger at my face and yelled that he had raised me, provided for me, and put a roof over my head. He screamed that it was absolutely sickening that I would hide this kind of immense wealth while my own flesh and blood suffered and struggled to survive. He demanded to know how I could be so incredibly selfish while my parents were facing public humiliation. The sheer hypocrisy of his words made a bitter laugh escape my throat. I fired back with a relentless fury that made him physically step back. I asked him calmly if he really wanted to talk about how he raised me. I asked him if he had conveniently forgotten the morning of my 18th birthday. I watched my mother's eyes dart away, knowing exactly what memory I was pulling from the dark. I reminded Calvin that while other fathers were taking their daughters on college tours, he was secretly driving to the bank to illegally empty the college savings account my grandmother had set up for me. I told him I still remember the gut-wrenching betrayal of opening my first tuition bill, only to discover that the account held $0. I recounted how he had drained my entire academic future just to hand Julian $30,000 for a down payment on a flashy new sports car because Julian needed to look successful for his new fraternity brothers. My father had sacrificed my education, my future, and my security just to fund his golden boy's fragile ego. I told him he lost the right to call himself my father on that exact day, and that he had zero right to stand in my boardroom and demand loyalty when he had robbed me of mine the second I became an adult. Julian's face was slick with cold sweat as he tried to formulate another lie to save himself. He opened his mouth to speak, but before a single word could escape his lips, the heavy glass doors of the boardroom violently burst open. Courtney stormed into the room, moving like a hurricane of white silk and fury. But she was not alone. Marching right behind her were her wealthy aristocratic parents, looking absolutely murderous. Her father, an intimidating man in a custom gray suit, pushed past my security guards with the entitlement of a man who owned the city. Courtney's mother was clutching a piece of paper in her trembling hand, her face contorted with high society embarrassment. Courtney ignored me entirely and marched straight up to Julian. She shoved him backward and demanded at the top of her lungs to know why the $33,000 wedding check he had given her father just bounced across 3 different banks. She screamed that her parents' caterers and florists were threatening to sue their family for fraud and that her pristine reputation was being dragged through the mud. The absolute collision of their two worlds had finally happened. Courtney's perfect wealthy family was now standing directly in my territory, demanding answers from a golden boy who was entirely bankrupt. Julian's face went from a mask of absolute terror to a twisted portrait of pure victimhood in a fraction of a second. Courtney's father was standing in the center of my boardroom, his face purple with rage as he waved the bounced $33,000 check in the air, demanding an explanation for why his daughter's perfect wedding was being threatened by caterers and event planners. Julian knew he was trapped. He was backed into a corner, with his completely bankrupt reality staring him right in the face. But my brother had spent his entire life mastering the art of manipulation and dodging consequences. Instead of confessing to his massive financial frauds, he dropped to his knees right there on the plush carpet of my boardroom and began to put on an Oscar-worthy performance. Julian buried his face in his hands and started sobbing violently, his shoulders heaving with fake agonizing tears. He wailed that he was so sorry, looking up at his wealthy in-laws with wet, pathetic eyes. He reached out and desperately clutched the hem of Courtney's designer dress, begging her to believe him. Then he lifted a trembling finger and pointed it directly at me. Julian screamed that none of this was his fault. He cried out that I had completely lost my mind and orchestrated a massive cyber attack against his corporate accounts. He spun a wild, desperate lie claiming that I had hacked into his private bank files and frozen his assets out of a deep-seated psychotic jealousy. He sobbed louder, claiming I had spent my entire life envying his success, his charm, and his beautiful new wife. He told Courtney's parents that I was a bitter, unstable woman who could not stand to see him happy, and that I had used my minor position at this company to illegally intercept his wedding funds and redirect his wealth just to ruin his reputation. He was practically hyperventilating as he painted himself as the innocent victim of a deranged sister who was obsessed with destroying his perfect life. He cried that he had tried so hard to include me in his life, only for me to turn around and commit corporate sabotage just to humiliate him in front of the people he loved most. His lies poured out in a frantic, pathetic stream of weaponized tears and manufactured panic. He begged Courtney to trust him, swearing on his life that the money was sitting safely in his accounts yesterday, and that I had maliciously wiped his financial existence off the map overnight, out of pure spite. Without a single second of hesitation, Brenda and Calvin threw themselves into the illusion to protect their golden boy. My mother immediately dropped to her knees beside Julian, wrapping her arms around his shaking shoulders and shooting me a look of pure, unadulterated venom. She began profusely apologizing to Courtney's parents, her voice trembling with dramatic shame. Brenda wailed that her daughter had always been a deeply disturbed individual who was prone to bitter fits of jealousy. She lied right to their faces, claiming I had a history of trying to sabotage my brother's milestones and that my mental state had clearly deteriorated into outright criminality. Calvin puffed out his chest and stepped in front of Julian, acting as his physical shield. My father desperately tried to placate his wealthy new-in-laws, bowing his head and swearing that he would personally see to it that I was punished for this horrific act of cyber-terrorism. He told them that Julian was an honest, hard-working entrepreneur who had been blindsided by a vicious and unstable sister. Courtney's parents absorbed every single toxic lie without question. Their own high society arrogance made them eager to believe that their son-in-law was a helpless victim rather than a common con artist. Courtney's father stepped forward, adjusting his expensive suit jacket, his face a mask of absolute disgust. He looked me up and down as if I were something scraped off the bottom of his shoe, entirely ignoring the fact that we were standing in my multi-million-dollar boardroom surrounded by my security staff. He crossed his arms over his chest and told me with chilling hostility that he was not some suburban pushover I could intimidate. He sneered that his personal legal team would be tearing my life apart by nightfall. He pointed a stiff finger directly at my chest and promised me that hacking into financial institutions and stealing $33,000 from his son-in-law was a major federal offense. His voice boomed off the glass walls of the boardroom as he threatened to personally call the FBI and have me dragged out of my own building in handcuffs. He bragged about his connections, boasting that he would ensure I spent the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary for cybercrimes and grand larceny. He told me my pathetic little tantrum was over and that I was going to pay dearly for embarrassing his family. He stood there, radiating privileged rage, fully convinced he had just put me in my place. The cacophony of their screaming and their empty threats bounced around the soundproof walls of my boardroom. My parents were still hovering over Julian, treating him like a wounded bird, while Courtney's father continued to shout about federal prison and cybersecurity charges. Courtney was glaring at me with the same vicious entitlement she had shown when she shoved that gold pen into my chest back at my parents' house. They were all waiting for me to crack. They were waiting for me to panic, to beg for forgiveness, or to desperately try and defend myself against their wall of lies. They expected me to revert to the silent scapegoat they had bullied for decades, trying frantically to explain my side of the story to people who never cared to listen. I did not try to defend myself. I did not raise my voice or offer a single excuse. The silence I maintained was far more powerful than any argument I could have made. I slowly walked over to the mahogany table and picked up my ceramic coffee mug. The room grew tense as they watched me move with complete, unbothered calm. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the dark roast, letting the bitter heat ground me in the reality of the moment. I lowered the mug and casually pushed back the sleeve of my bespoke suit to look at my designer watch. The quiet ticking of the second hand felt loud in my own ears. I looked up and met the furious gaze of Courtney's father. Then let my eyes drift down to Julian, who was still kneeling on the floor pretending to cry. His fake sobs began to hitch in his throat as the reality of my calm demeanor finally pierced through his desperate performance. He could see the cold, dead-eyed calculation in my stare, and he knew in that singular moment that his trap had failed entirely. I smiled a chilling smile that silenced the entire room. I spoke with absolute quiet authority, letting my words slice through the heavy air. I told them the FBI is already on their way, but they aren't coming for me. The immediate aftermath of that boardroom confrontation resulted in Julian fleeing the building like a rat, abandoning a sinking ship, with his furious new in-laws screaming right behind him. Fast forward, exactly 1 week later. Courtney's family was desperately trying to patch up the massive gaping holes in their pristine societal image. They decided to host a lavish post-wedding brunch at the most exclusive high-end country club in the state. It was a pathetic attempt to save face and prove to their wealthy friends that everything was perfectly fine and that Julian's bounced checks were just a minor banking error that had already been resolved. Courtney's parents had spent the entire week calling their country club friends to assure them that their new son-in-law was the victim of a corporate misunderstanding and that their family fortune was as solid as ever. My parents, of course, were invited as guests of honor, still desperately clinging to the illusion that Julian was a successful tech genius who was simply going through a temporary rough patch. I was strictly banned from the premises. Calvin had left 3 separate aggressive voicemails on my private cell phone, threatening to have me arrested for trespassing if I dared to show my face and ruin Courtney's special recovery brunch. He still fully believed he could dictate my movements and control the narrative, just like he did when I was a helpless child living under his roof. What none of them understood was that I was not planning to attend as the disgraced estranged sister. I was arriving in a completely different capacity. Over the past 7 days, I had handed over every single piece of evidence regarding Julian's massive financial frauds to the federal authorities. The massive web of shell companies, the forged signatures, the stolen identities. It was all neatly packaged and delivered by Apex Equity. Because my firm was the primary creditor, the government asked me to personally assist in the asset recovery phase to identify the shell accounts I had already mapped out. So when I drove up to the wrought iron gates of the prestigious country club, I did not come alone. I was acting as an official liaison for the Federal Audit Bureau. I parked my car right in the circular driveway, ignoring the frantic protests of the valet attendants who tried to wave me away. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored charcoal suit and took a deep breath of the crisp morning air. This was the moment everything they had built on lies would finally collapse in front of the audience they cared about most. I was about to tear down the fake empire Julian had built using my stolen future. I walked through the heavy oak double doors of the country club dining room flanked by 2 imposing federal economic crime agents. They wore dark windbreakers with thick yellow letters across the back and carried thick manila folders containing federal warrants. The dining room was a sea of pastel floral arrangements, crystal champagne flutes, and wealthy socialites laughing over plates of imported caviar. A live string quartet was playing a joyful classical melody in the corner of the room, setting a sickeningly perfect tone for their web of lies. The moment the heavy doors swung open and the three of us stepped onto the pristine white carpet, the music died instantly. A cellist actually dropped his bow in shock as the heavy thud echoed across the room. The room fell into a dead, terrifying silence as every single head turned to stare at the federal agents marching through their private brunch. I spotted my family sitting at the head table of honor right next to Courtney and her wealthy parents. Julian had a glass of mimosa halfway to his mouth, and his hand started shaking so violently that the orange liquid spilled all over his expensive white linen shirt. Calvin stood up so fast his chair tipped over and crashed onto the hardwood floor behind him. Brenda let out a sharp gasp of pure, absolute horror. She saw the federal agents, she saw the crest on their jackets, and then she saw me standing tall and completely unbothered in the center of the room. The public humiliation was too much for her fragile ego to process. The facade of the perfect wealthy mother of the groom instantly shattered into a million pieces. All she saw was the daughter she hated deliberately destroying the most important social event of her golden boy's life. This was exactly how she had always operated. Whenever Julian failed a test or wrecked a car or stole money, Brenda would always find a way to physically and emotionally punish me for his mistakes. If Julian was unhappy, it was somehow always my fault, and I had to pay the price. Without a single ounce of logical thought, Brenda let out a furious shriek and lunged forward. She pushed past a waiter knocking a tray of crystal flutes and mimosas to the ground and charged directly at me. Her face was twisted with pure, unfiltered rage. Her hand raised high above her head, ready to physically strike me right there in front of the entire country club. She yelled that I was a vile, jealous monster who could not stand to let my brother have a single day of happiness. She was completely blinded by her lifelong habit of abusing me into submission, believing she could just slap the reality away like she always did. Brenda's hand never even made it close to my face. Before I even had to flinch, the federal agent standing to my right stepped forward and easily caught her wrist in a vice-like grip. He shoved her arm back down to her side with forceful authority and sternly warned her that assaulting a federal liaison during an active investigation would result in her immediate arrest and detainment. My mother stumbled backward, gasping for air as if she had just been struck by lightning. She looked around the room, realizing that dozens of wealthy socialites and country club members were watching her act like an unhinged, violent criminal. Courtney's parents shrank back in their seats, completely mortified to be associated with such a spectacle. I did not even look at my mother. I walked past her trembling form, past my pale father, and straight up to the small stage where the string quartet had been sitting in stunned silence. I calmly picked up the microphone from its heavy iron stand and tapped it twice with my index finger. The sharp thumping sound echoed through the massive dining room, cutting through the panicked whispers and forcing everyone in the room to freeze in their tracks. I looked out over the sea of stunned faces and demanded total, absolute silence. My voice was steady, devoid of any fear or hesitation, carrying absolute authority over the entire room. I unclasped the thick leather folder I had been carrying and pulled out the crisp government document stamped with the official federal seal. I looked directly into Julian's terrified, weeping eyes, watching his entire carefully constructed world finally crumble into dust. And then I began to read the federal asset freeze mandate aloud to the captive crowd. I clearly listed every fraudulent account, every fake shell company, and the immediate federal seizure of all assets tied to his name and the names of his blind guarantors, including my parents' entire life savings. I made sure every single person in that room heard the absolute undeniable truth of who Julian really was. I did not just stop at reading the mandate from a piece of paper. I signaled to the country club manager, who was standing frozen by the kitchen's swinging doors, and ordered him to lower the massive projector screen they usually reserved for their elite charity galas. Before Calvin could even open his mouth to protest, I walked over to the audio-visual podium and connected my secure tablet directly into the display system. The entire wall behind the string quartet suddenly illuminated with crystal-clear high-definition images of Julian's actual financial reality. Loud gasps echoed across the dining room as I swiped through slide after slide of undeniable catastrophic evidence. I projected the registration documents for his so-called tech startup, proving to the entire room of wealthy investors and socialites that the company possessed 0 patents, 0 employees, and 0 actual revenue. It was nothing but a fraudulent shell company operating a classic Ponzi scheme. I displayed the wire transfers showing exactly how Julian had been moving newly acquired investment capital directly into his personal checking accounts to fund his fake lifestyle. The crowd stared in absolute horror as the screen displayed the exact transaction histories for the leasing of his luxury cars, the deposits for his destination, bachelor party, and the massive down payments for this very wedding brunch. Every single dollar he had spent to impress Courtney and her family was stolen money. I swiped to the next slide, projecting a highly detailed flowchart that traced the stolen funds right back to their original sources. The room grew so quiet you could hear the ice melting in the water glasses. I explained into the microphone that Julian's entire tech empire was built on the backs of gullible investors who believed his charismatic lies, and that the Federal Audit Bureau had been tracking these phantom transfers for the last 8 months. I looked right at Julian, who was completely paralyzed on the floor, watching his carefully constructed illusion of success being broadcast as a federal crime right in front of his wealthy new friends. He had spent years treating me like an ugly, uneducated loser while he paraded around as the golden boy genius. Now, everyone in his elite circle was staring at cold, hard bank statements, proving he was nothing more than a pathetic thief who financed his arrogance with other people's life savings. The whispers in the room grew into an angry buzzing sound as the elite guests realized they were eating caviar paid for by a criminal. Julian had always bragged about his massive success and his brilliant coding skills, but the screens proved he did not even know how to write a single line of code. He was just a smooth-talking salesman who used big tech buzzwords to steal from the elderly and the greedy. The guests who had been cheering for him minutes ago were now pulling out their phones, frantically checking their own bank accounts to see if they had fallen for his trap. The absolute devastation on the faces of Courtney's family was almost poetic. Courtney let out a blood-curdling scream as the projector displayed a specific series of wire transfers that carried her own family name. Her mother collapsed back into her plush chair, clutching her chest and weeping hysterically into her linen napkin as the realization of their complete financial ruin washed over her. Courtney's father, however, did not collapse. He turned a terrifying shade of purple, his eyes bulging as he stared at the screen and read the exact dollar amounts of his own compromised accounts. The man who had just threatened to throw me in a federal penitentiary suddenly lunged across the pristine white carpet and grabbed Julian by the collar of his ruined shirt. He hauled my brother up from the floor with a terrifying strength, shaking him violently as he screamed directly into his face. He roared, "You told me you invested my retirement funds into an AI algorithm." His voice cracked with pure desperation as he violently shoved Julian back against the head table, causing crystal glasses to shatter across the floor. He yelled that Julian had promised him a guaranteed triple return on his life savings, and that he had liquidated his entire estate based on Julian's fake financial projections. The backstory of Julian's ultimate con was bleeding out for the entire country club to see. My golden child brother had not just scammed random strangers. He had preyed on his own father-in-law, using his engagement to Courtney as the ultimate cover to drain her family's wealth. He had sat at their dinner table, drank their expensive wine, and convinced them to hand over their entire legacy for a piece of his fake company. Calvin and Brenda stood frozen in absolute terror, watching the wealthy patriarch they had spent months kissing up to now, trying to physically destroy their precious son. My father tried to step forward to intervene, but one of the federal agents immediately blocked his path with a firm hand against his chest, warning him to stay back and let the scene play out. Calvin's face was pale and sweaty, his entire worldview shattering as he realized his perfect son was a monumental fraud. Brenda was sobbing uncontrollably, gripping the edge of the table as she watched the wealthy family she had bragged about to all her friends turn into a vengeful mob. Courtney's father kept screaming that Julian had ruined them, that the money he stole was supposed to fund his younger daughter's trust and secure their legacy for generations to come. He demanded to know where the money was, shaking Julian so hard that his expensive watch flew off his wrist and skittered across the floor. The glorious facade of the successful tech genius and his beautiful, wealthy bride was completely annihilated, reduced to a screaming match over stolen retirement funds in the middle of a ruined brunch. Julian was completely hyperventilating, his chest heaving as he desperately tried to break free from his father-in-law's grip. His eyes darted wildly around the room, searching for a way out, searching for anyone who would believe his lies. The walls were closing in, and the reality of federal prison was staring him right in the face. His carefully crafted mask of superiority had entirely melted away, leaving nothing but a sweating, pathetic coward. In a final act of pure delusion, Julian raised a shaking hand and pointed a trembling finger directly at me. He screamed with a raw, broken voice, "It is her! She manipulated the numbers. She has all the money." He wailed to the horrified crowd that I was a financial genius who had framed him, that I had orchestrated the entire Ponzi scheme from my corporate office and planted his name on the documents. He cried out that the federal agents were being fooled by my brilliant hacking skills and begged his father-in-law to realize that I was the real criminal, holding all their stolen wealth. He swore up and down that I had set him up because I was so deeply jealous of his wedding and his new family. The room fell dead silent once again as every eye shifted from the sweating mess of my brother back to me standing calmly at the podium. I did not flinch at his desperate accusation. I did not try to defend myself against his frantic screaming. I simply reached into my heavy leather briefcase and slowly pulled out a massive, thick dossier. The cover was stamped with a giant, bold red seal of the Federal Indictment Bureau. I held it up for the entire room to see, feeling the heavy weight of the paper in my hands. It was the undeniable proof of his guilt, the final nail in the coffin of his fake empire. Courtney stood completely frozen, staring at the massive federal indictment dossier in my hands, as the horrific reality finally smashed through her delusions of grandeur. The heavy, glossy paper with the bright red seal was the ultimate proof that she had not married into the billionaire tech dynasty she had been bragging about to her high society friends for the past year. Instead, she was legally bound to a broke, heavily indebted criminal who was entirely bankrupt. The elegant poise and manufactured grace she had spent her entire life perfecting instantly evaporated into thin air. All her profound declarations of unconditional love and soulmate connection vanished the exact second she realized Julian's bank accounts were completely empty. Courtney slowly turned her head to look at the man she had just married, and the expression on her face was a terrifying mixture of repulsion and absolute hatred. The charming, sophisticated tech genius she thought she secured was currently a sweaty, hyperventilating mess cowering against a broken table while federal agents boxed him in. Courtney let out a visceral shriek that made the remaining country club guests flinch and cover their ears. She lunged at Julian not to protect him but to tear him apart. She screamed that he was a pathetic, poor liar who had completely ruined her life and destroyed her pristine societal reputation. She cursed at him, calling him a worthless scam artist and a disgusting fraud. She wailed that she had turned down legitimate wealthy suitors for him because he promised her a life of private jets and international estates. The sheer venom in her voice was staggering as she verbally shredded every single lie he had ever told her. She yelled that she could not believe she had let a common thief touch her, and that the very sight of his face made her sick to her stomach. Courtney's parents did nothing to stop their daughter's vicious verbal assault. Her father was still breathing heavily, glaring at Julian with murderous intent, while her mother nodded along with Courtney, screaming as if Julian was a rabid animal that needed to be put down. Julian raised his trembling hands, trying to shush his furious bride, begging her to lower her voice, and promising that they could somehow fix this mess. He sobbed that he loved her, and that he only did all of this to give her the perfect lavish wedding she deserved. Courtney let out a harsh, bitter laugh that sounded almost unhinged. She screamed that he did not know the first thing about love, and that his pathetic attempts to buy her affection with stolen money were nothing but the actions of a weak, desperate coward. She paced back and forth in her ruined designer dress, yelling that her entire friend group was going to mock her for the rest of her life, because she had been stupid enough to marry a penniless con man who could not even afford his own car leases. The fury radiating from Courtney only intensified as Julian continued to whimper and make pathetic excuses on the floor. She looked down at her hands, and her eyes locked onto the massive, sparkling diamond wedding ring that Julian had placed on her finger just a few days prior. The ring he had bragged about importing from Europe. The ring he claimed cost more than most people's houses. Courtney's face twisted with utter revulsion, as if the jewelry itself was suddenly burning her skin. She violently grabbed her own hand and began aggressively yanking at the massive diamond. She twisted and pulled with such ferocious force that her knuckle turned bright red. With a final vicious tug, she ripped the ring off her finger and hurled it directly at Julian's chest. The heavy diamond struck him right on his collarbone and bounced off, hitting the hardwood floor with a sharp metallic clatter that echoed in the silent room. Courtney screamed that she wanted an immediate annulment and that she would rather die than spend another second sharing a last name with a bankrupt criminal. She turned her back on him, completely discarding him the exact moment his money vanished. Then her frantic eyes darted across the room and locked onto me. The woman she had relentlessly bullied, the sister she had mocked and humiliated, the scapegoat she had sneered at just an hour ago. Courtney realized that I was the one holding the federal dossier and the absolute power over the remaining assets. Her arrogant superiority instantly collapsed into pure, panicked desperation. She stumbled toward me, her designer heels slipping on the ruined carpet, and she practically threw herself at my feet. She held up her hands and began begging me in a pathetic, whining voice that was entirely devoid of pride. Courtney cried out that she had absolutely nothing to do with any of Julian's schemes, and that she was just an innocent victim who had been horribly tricked. She pleaded with me not to freeze her personal bank accounts or touch her luxury assets. She sobbed that her custom diamonds, her imported designer bags, and her expensive cars belonged strictly to her, and that I could not legally take them away, just because her husband was a fraud. She scrambled to explain that her family had kept their finances separate, and that she was completely ignorant of his Ponzi scheme. The backstory of her shallow, materialistic existence was on full display as she prioritized her luxury handbags over the fact that her husband was facing decades in federal prison. She wept that she had worked hard to build her collection of high-end jewelry, and that it would be a gross miscarriage of justice if the Federal Audit Bureau seized her personal closets. Courtney shamelessly abandoned every shred of dignity, whining that I needed to tell the federal agents to leave her pristine reputation and her expensive lifestyle alone, because she was just a helpless bride who had been duped by a master manipulator. I looked down at Courtney groveling on the floor with absolute, unadulterated disgust. The woman who had spent months parading around my parents' house treating me like a peasant because I chose to work hard instead of marrying into wealth was now practically crawling on her hands and knees to protect her precious designer handbags. Her entire existence was reduced to a desperate plea to save her material possessions, while the man she swore to love was facing federal indictment. I did not flinch or offer her a single ounce of sympathy. I stared at her tear-streaked face and spoke with a quiet, chilling authority that made her flinch. I told her that the federal government did not care about her innocent bride routine because financial crimes leave an undeniable paper trail. I slowly pointed my finger at the massive diamond ring that was currently resting on the hardwood floor, just inches from Julian's trembling knees. I looked Courtney dead in the eye and informed her that the magnificent imported diamond she had just violently thrown at her husband was not a symbol of his immense wealth or his endless devotion. I told her flatly that the ring was purchased using a fraudulent high-limit credit card that Julian had illegally opened using my stolen identity. The entire room gasped as the horrific reality of his identity theft was finally dragged into the light. I turned to the federal economic crime agent standing to my right and instructed him to secure the stolen property. I told Courtney she was not going to keep her bags or her diamonds because every single luxury item Julian had ever given her was bought with stolen funds, and they were all marked for immediate federal seizure. The agent stepped forward, his heavy boots thudding against the floor, and calmly scooped up the massive diamond ring, securing it in a clear plastic evidence bag right in front of Courtney's horrified eyes. The sharp crinkle of the plastic evidence bag sealing shut echoed like a gunshot in the silent dining room. Courtney let out a strangled gasp as the agent slipped the diamond ring into his pocket, treating her multi-million-dollar symbol of superiority like a piece of cheap stolen merchandise. That single mundane action finally shattered the thick layer of denial protecting my parents. The freezing reality of the moment washed over the head table. Brenda and Calvin had spent their entire lives worshipping the altar of public perception, and now their worst nightmare was unfolding live in front of the very people they desperately wanted to impress. The federal seal, the warrants, the confiscated jewelry, and Julian weeping on the floor finally penetrated their arrogant delusions. The gravity of the catastrophic situation hit them all at once. Julian was going to federal prison, and their golden boy was completely finished. Brenda stared at the federal agents, and then down at her precious son, who was still sobbing weakly against the baseboards. The blood completely drained from her face, leaving her looking gray and suddenly very fragile. The pristine posture she had maintained for decades crumbled in an instant. Without a single thought for her expensive silk gown or the horrified stares of her country club friends, my mother dropped heavily to her knees. She scrambled across the ruined white carpet, her hands desperately reaching out toward me. Calvin was only seconds behind her. The imposing, arrogant patriarch, who had spent his life dictating my every move and threatening me with absolute authority, folded like a wet napkin. He fell to his knees right beside his wife, his broad shoulders shaking with violent, pathetic sobs. They crawled toward me like beggars, entirely abandoning whatever shred of dignity they had left. Brenda grabbed the hem of my tailored trousers, her perfectly manicured fingers clutching the fabric as if I were her only lifeline. Tears mixed with heavy black mascara streamed down her cheeks, leaving dark, ugly tracks across her powdered face. She wept uncontrollably, begging me to stop the agents pleading with me to show mercy on my brother. She wailed that Julian did not mean to hurt anyone and that he was just confused and overwhelmed by the pressure of the business world. Calvin looked up at me with red-rimmed, watery eyes, his voice cracking as he desperately invoked the sacred bond of family. He cried out that blood is thicker than water and that no matter what misunderstandings we had in the past, we were still flesh and blood. He begged me to remember that family protects family against outsiders, and that I could not possibly let the federal government take my own brother away in handcuffs. They pleaded with me to drop the charges, to fix the numbers, to use my position at the audit bureau to make the whole nightmare just disappear. They were perfectly willing to let me cover up a massive federal crime as long as it kept their golden boy out of prison and their country club membership intact. I stood completely still, looking down at the two people who had brought me into this world. Their weeping and begging should have evoked some kind of pity or perhaps a lingering sense of familial duty. But as I stared at their tear-stained faces, I felt absolutely nothing but ice in my veins. The sight of them groveling at my feet did not make me feel powerful. It just made me realize how truly empty they were. I slowly reached down and peeled my mother's shaking fingers off the fabric of my suit, stepping back out of their reach. The simple rejection caused Brenda to let out a wounded gasp, but I did not break eye contact. My voice was quiet, but it carried a chilling, absolute finality that cut through their frantic sobbing. I repeated the word, blood, letting it hang in the stale air of the dining room. I asked them where that sacred blood bond was on Julian's wedding day. I reminded them in vivid detail how they had treated me just a few weeks prior. I spoke about how they had forced me to sit alone in a sweltering parking lot, staring at my phone, to watch the ceremony on a lagging internet livestream because they decided my presence would somehow ruin the aesthetic of their perfect family photographs. They had banished their own flesh and blood to the asphalt outside just so they could maintain the illusion of a flawless high society pedigree for Courtney's parents. I watched Calvin's eyes dart toward the floor as I brought up the darkest period of my entire life. I reminded them of the deep, suffocating depression that had nearly broken my spirit when I was younger. I recounted how I had begged them for help, how I had isolated myself in my room, completely drowning in a darkness I could not control. Instead of acting like parents, instead of holding my hand or getting me the medical support I desperately needed, they had hidden me away like a shameful secret. I reminded Brenda of the exact words she had used when she found me crying on the bathroom floor. She had looked at me with pure disgust and called me a family disgrace. She had told her wealthy friends that I was just a lazy, ungrateful burden who was trying to steal attention away from Julian's recent college achievements. They had happily sacrificed my mental health and my basic human dignity every single time it meant elevating their precious son. They had spent decades treating me like an infectious disease that needed to be quarantined away from their shiny, perfect lives. They only cared about the concept of family when it was convenient for them and when it protected their own selfish interests. I looked down at them, my expression completely devoid of any forgiveness or warmth. I told them with absolute crystal clear certainty that they had no daughter. Brenda let out a breathless wail, covering her mouth with both hands as the absolute finality of my rejection hit her. Calvin slumped forward, his forehead nearly touching the carpet, totally broken by the reality that their lifelong scapegoat was the one holding the axe to their empire. The dining room was completely silent, save for the pathetic sound of their weeping and the nervous shuffling of the country club guests who were trapped watching this miserable spectacle. Then the senior federal agent standing to my left slowly cleared his throat. He stepped forward, his heavy boots planting firmly on the carpet right next to where my parents were kneeling. He did not look at them with any sympathy or understanding. He reached into his thick leather briefcase and pulled out two separate heavy manila envelopes. He read their full legal names aloud, his voice booming with official government authority over the quiet room. He looked down at their tear-streaked faces and calmly informed them that they were severely misunderstanding their current situation. He stated that they were not simply bystanders or unfortunate witnesses to their son's massive financial collapse. The agent explained that they were currently under active federal investigation as primary accomplices to the massive fraud ring. He read directly from the document, stating that federal prosecutors had undeniable proof that Brenda and Calvin had knowingly signed heavily forged mortgage documents to secure the blind guarantees for Julian's fake shell companies. He told them that their signatures directly tied them to the stolen funds and the illegal asset transfers, making them fully liable for the stolen millions. The realization that they were not just losing their social status, but their freedom, their home, and their entire life savings hit them like a physical blow. Brenda let out a hollow, breathless gasp, her eyes rolling back as she collapsed entirely flat onto the floor in total, absolute despair. Calvin buried his face in his shaking hands, letting out a guttural sound of pure, inescapable defeat as the federal trap snapped completely shut around them. Calvin and Brenda were still weeping on the floor, completely consumed by the crushing weight of their impending federal charges. Their pathetic sobs echoed through the dining room while the federal agent stood over them reading the details of their financial crimes. Julian was still backed into a corner near the head table. He looked at his mother sobbing on the carpet, and then he looked at his father clutching his chest in total defeat. Instead of rushing to comfort the parents who had literally sacrificed their entire lives and their freedom to protect his fragile ego, Julian did exactly what he had always done. he decided to run away. The sheer panic in his eyes was unmistakable, as he realized the agents were entirely focused on the dramatic collapse of his parents. He saw a tiny window of opportunity and he took it. Without a single word of apology or comfort to his ruined family or his screaming bride, Julian suddenly bolted. He scrambled up from the floor, knocking over a row of crystal champagne flutes that shattered into 1,000 tiny pieces across the hardwood. He shoved past the heavy oak chairs, leaving a trail of chaotic destruction in his wake. The country club guests gasped and pulled their children out of the way as the disgraced groom charged through the dining room like a terrified animal. A young waiter carrying a massive silver tray of hors d'oeuvres was stepping out of the kitchen, swinging doors just as Julian sprinted past. My brother did not even try to avoid him. Julian violently shoved the poor waiter right in the chest, launching the young man backward into a towering floral arrangement. The silver tray crashed to the floor, sending expensive appetizers flying in every direction. But Julian did not even turn his head to look. He was running on pure adrenaline and absolute terror. He sprinted down the luxurious carpeted hallway of the country club, tearing off his silk wedding tie and throwing it to the ground. His breathing was heavy and ragged as he burst through the massive front doors of the building and out into the bright afternoon sunlight. His only goal was to reach the valet parking lot where his prized possession was waiting for him. He was desperately trying to reach the sleek silver Porsche that he had purchased using my stolen identity. He thought if he could just get behind the wheel of that car, he could speed out of the country club gates and disappear before the federal agents even realized he was missing from the dining room. He was a coward, running from the consequences of a lifetime of lies, leaving his parents to take the fall for his massive financial crimes. He truly believed he could just abandon everyone who loved him and start over somewhere else, using whatever cash he had hidden away in his pockets. What Julian did not realize was that I had already anticipated this exact scenario. I knew the deepest, darkest parts of my brother's personality. I knew his cowardice better than anyone else in the world. Whenever he wrecked a family car or failed a college class or got caught stealing money from our parents' wallets, he always ran away and hid until my mother cleaned up the mess and blamed me for his mistakes. I knew that the second the pressure became too heavy, he would abandon everyone who supported his delusions just to save his own skin. So while the federal agents were busy explaining the indictment to Calvin and Brenda, I had quietly slipped out through a side door near the kitchen. I walked calmly around the exterior of the country club and positioned myself right in the middle of the circular driveway leading out of the valet parking lot. I watched as Julian sprinted frantically toward his luxury car. His hands were shaking so violently that he dropped his keys twice on the hot pavement before finally managing to unlock the door. He threw himself into the plush leather driver's seat and slammed the heavy door shut. The engine roared to life with a deafening, aggressive growl that echoed off the pristine walls of the country club exterior. He revved the engine desperately, trying to shift the car into gear to make his grand escape. But before he could even press his foot onto the accelerator, I stepped directly into his line of sight. I stood completely still in the center of the narrow exit lane, blocking his only path to the main road. I crossed my arms over my chest, staring at him through the windshield with eyes of absolute ice. Julian slammed his hands against the steering wheel, his face turning a blotchy, terrifying shade of purple. He rolled down the window and the sound of his furious screaming filled the parking lot. He yelled at me to get out of his way, calling me every vile name he could think of. He revved the engine again, sending a loud, threatening roar through the air, trying to intimidate me into stepping aside. He screamed that he would run me right over if I did not move immediately. The commotion was so loud that the wealthy country club guests began pouring out of the front doors of the building, watching the horrific spectacle unfold in the driveway. They whispered and pointed in absolute shock as the groom threatened to run over his own sister with a sports car. Julian leaned his head out the window, bellowing that I had ruined his entire life and that I was a jealous monster who deserved to be crushed under his tires. I did not flinch. I did not move a single inch. I stood my ground, remembering the day he had left me stranded in a dark parking lot to watch his college graduation on a live stream, just because he did not want my presence to embarrass him in front of his wealthy friends. I remembered when my severe depression had almost broken my spirit entirely, and he and my parents had called me a pathetic family disgrace. They had stripped me of my humanity for years, and now he expected me to just step aside and let him drive away into the sunset. I looked at him with absolute zero emotion. I let him scream and curse and rev the engine, knowing that he was completely out of options. He had no family to rely on to save him this time. He was just a trapped rat sitting in a stolen car, completely surrounded by the consequences of his own horrific actions. Julian was completely blinded by his own frantic desperation. He bared his teeth like a cornered animal and slammed his hand onto the gear shift, pulling it into drive. The expensive tires of the Porsche let out a sharp, aggressive squeal against the smooth pavement as he prepared to step on the gas pedal and plow right through me. But just as the heavy vehicle jerked forward, the deafening wail of police sirens suddenly shattered the afternoon air. The sound came from every single direction at once, completely drowning out the roar of the sports car engine. Flashing red and blue lights violently reflected off the silver hood of the Porsche, blinding Julian in the driver's seat. Before he could even process what was happening, two massive, heavily armored police squad cars came screeching around the corner of the country club driveway. The heavy tires smoked as they slammed on the brakes, skidding to a halt right in front of the Porsche. They completely boxed him in, blocking any possible chance of escape. Julian froze in absolute terror as the doors of the squad cars flew open and multiple federal officers swarmed the vehicle. They shouted commands demanding that he shut off the engine and step out of the car with his hands raised. Julian was too paralyzed by fear to even move. An officer did not wait for his compliance. The federal agent violently yanked the driver's side door open and grabbed Julian by the collar of his ruined, expensive wedding shirt. The agent hauled my screaming, crying brother out of the luxury leather seat with absolute brute force. Julian thrashed and wailed, kicking his legs like a toddler throwing a tantrum, but the officers easily overpowered his pathetic struggles. They spun him around and violently slammed him face down against the sleek hood of the Porsche. The expensive metal dented inward under the sudden heavy impact of his body. Julian gasped for air. His cheek pressed flat against the hot silver metal of the stolen car, while the officers forcefully wrenched his arms behind his back and secured the heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. As the federal agents violently shoved Julian into the back of the heavily armored squad car, the heavy steel doors slammed shut, echoing like a gunshot across the silent parking lot. The horrific spectacle of my brother's arrest was finally over, but the outrage of his new in-laws was just beginning to boil over. Courtney's father burst through the grand double front doors of the country club, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. His pristine, custom-tailored tuxedo was rumpled, and his fists were clenched so tightly by his sides that his knuckles were completely white against the evening shadows. He marched directly toward me, his heavy dress shoes stomping aggressively across the asphalt, entirely ignoring the flashing red and blue police lights and the federal agents securing the perimeter. He was not just furious about his liquidated retirement funds, he was absolutely, completely, and totally humiliated. His perfect society daughter had just married a bankrupt criminal, and the entire elite country club had watched the disaster unfold while eating imported caviar. He stopped mere inches from my face, breathing heavily like a cornered animal, and he began to scream. He roared with a terrifying volume that my entire family was nothing but a pack of bottom-feeding scammers who had crawled out of the gutter to steal from legitimate high society elites. He pointed a shaking finger right at my face and threatened to unleash a massive battalion of ruthless corporate lawyers on me the very next morning. He vowed to sue me, to sue my weeping parents, to sue my entire bloodline into absolute financial oblivion. He screamed that he would make sure I was buried under so much legal debt that I would be living on the streets for the rest of my miserable life begging for scraps. He yelled that the public humiliation of watching his daughter marry a penniless fraud in front of his billionaire golf buddies was unforgivable and that someone was going to pay the ultimate price for destroying his prestigious family name. The venom in his voice was staggering as he continued to hurl insult after insult at my upbringing, my career, and my very existence. He screamed that he would destroy me for being a pathetic accomplice to my brother's fraudulent Ponzi scheme, assuming I was just another criminal in the family. He threatened. He screamed. He demanded retribution using his immense wealth and his societal power as a blunt weapon to intimidate me into total submission. I did not take a single step back. I did not flinch at his loud, booming voice or his aggressive, looming posture. I let him scream, I let him threaten, I let him exhaust his arrogant lungs while the cold evening air blew across the dark parking lot. I stood perfectly still, holding my heavy leather briefcase against my side, watching his face turn a dangerous shade of purple. When he finally ran out of breath and stood there panting with rage, I looked up at him with a razor-sharp gaze that immediately made his violent posturing falter. I did not raise my voice to match his frantic anger. I spoke with a calm, measured authority that cut effortlessly through the chaotic tension of the moment. I slowly unclasped the brass lock of my briefcase, reached inside, and pulled out a single thin manila folder. It was not as thick or as visually imposing as the massive federal indictment dossier I had handed over earlier, but it was infinitely more dangerous to the wealthy patriarch standing in front of me. I held the folder up so the ambient light caught the smooth paper, and I looked him dead in the eye. I told him in a voice as cold as absolute ice that he really should watch his tone when speaking to me. I explained that during my exhaustive 8-month federal audit of Julian's fraudulent shell companies, the financial trails led my forensic accounting team down some very interesting, very illegal paths. I told him that Julian was incredibly sloppy with his digital security and that his hidden servers contained massive amounts of raw metadata regarding all of his high-net-worth investors, including his new father-in-law. I tapped the manila folder with my index finger and told Courtney's father that as part of this extensive audit, I was currently holding the exact financial records, proving his last 5 years of illegal offshore tax evasion. I explained that the documents inside the folder detailed every single hidden Cayman Islands bank account, every offshore dummy corporation he had set up to funnel undeclared income, and every fraudulent tax return he had filed while claiming to be an upstanding corporate citizen. I told him that he had spent decades pointing his judgmental finger at lower-class workers while he systematically robbed the federal government of millions of dollars to fund his luxurious country club lifestyle. I leaned in, slightly closing the distance between us, and whispered that he needed to behave himself right this very second, or this specific file was going straight to the Criminal Investigation Division of the IRS. The arrogant, untouchable patriarch of the wealthy family instantly went completely silent. The aggressive, furious flush in his cheeks vanished in a split second, leaving him looking like a pale, sickly ghost standing under the parking lot streetlights. His mouth opened and closed repeatedly, but absolutely no sound came out of his dry throat. The horrific realization that his entire elite existence, his freedom, and his carefully crafted public image were resting entirely in my hands completely shattered his manufactured superiority. Courtney's mother, and Courtney, who had followed him out to the driveway expecting to watch him verbally destroy me, heard every single word I said. The color completely drained from their faces as they stared at the thin manila folder, recognizing the absolute catastrophic peril they were now facing. The false bravery and the overwhelming arrogance of the wealthy elite evaporated into thin air, replaced by a heavy, suffocating dread. Without saying another word, without issuing a single legal threat, Courtney's father took a slow, terrified step backward away from me. His expensive suit suddenly looked like a cheap costume on a fleeing criminal. He reached out with a trembling hand and grabbed his weeping daughter's arm, pulling her back and motioning frantically for his terrified wife to follow him. The proud high society family turned around in total defeat and silently walked away from the flashing lights. They did not look at the police cars holding their new son-in-law. They did not look at my weeping parents on the ground, and they certainly did not look back at me. They simply lowered their heads in absolute disgrace and scurried away toward the back door of the restaurant, sneaking into the shadows like absolute cowards, desperate to escape the crushing weight of their own hidden crimes. Julian was violently hauled up from the dented hood of the silver Porsche, his arms securely locked behind his back in heavy steel handcuffs. The federal agents dragged him stumbling and sobbing back toward the entrance of the country club, where I stood completely unbothered by the spectacle. The tough, arrogant golden boy, who had spent his entire life taking whatever he wanted and stepping on my neck to get it, was now completely broken. His knees gave out the second the agent stopped walking, and he collapsed heavily onto the hard pavement right at my feet. The sharp gravel bit into his tailored trousers, but he did not even seem to notice the pain. He writhed on the ground like a pathetic worm, his tears mixing with the dirt and sweat on his face. Julian craned his neck, looking up at me with wide, terrified eyes that were completely stripped of their usual cruelty. He began to beg, sobbing so hysterically that his words barely made sense in the cool evening air. He pleaded with me to tell the agents that it was all a big misunderstanding and to drop the federal identity theft charges immediately. He cried that he would never survive in a federal prison, and that the inmates would tear a soft, rich boy like him to absolute pieces. His voice cracked as he swore on his life that he would somehow pay back every single penny he stole from my accounts, even though we both knew he was entirely bankrupt. The desperation in his wailing was deafening, as he promised to spend the rest of his miserable life working to repay his debt to me. He offered to be my servant, my driver, my personal assistant, anything I wanted, if I just made the massive federal indictment disappear. He groveled in the dirt, rubbing his wet face against my polished leather shoes, babbling that I was the smart one, the successful one, the sister he always secretly admired. The sheer hypocrisy of his sudden admiration was repulsive. The man who had relentlessly mocked my ambitions and stolen my identity to fund his fake billionaire lifestyle was now literally kissing my shoes and offering himself as my lifetime slave just to escape the terrifying reality of a concrete prison cell. He wailed that he was sorry for everything and that he would sign whatever papers I wanted as long as he could go home. I looked down at him, feeling absolutely no pity for the pathetic creature crying on the pavement. His tears meant nothing to me, because they were born entirely out of fear of punishment rather than any actual remorse for the lives he had destroyed. Before I could even process Julian's pathetic offers of lifelong servitude, my parents scrambled out from the country club doors. Brenda and Calvin had witnessed the entire arrest and the terrifying departure of Courtney's powerful family. Their desperate eyes were wide with a frantic, unhinged panic as they rushed toward me, completely ignoring the federal agents standing guard around the perimeter. Brenda threw herself onto the rough asphalt right next to Julian, tearing her expensive silk dress and scraping her knees on the sharp rocks. Calvin dropped heavily beside her, his massive frame shaking with uncontrollable sobs that echoed across the valet parking lot. They both reached out with trembling hands and tightly clutched the fabric of my pant legs, pulling at me as if I were a god who could rewrite reality. Brenda wailed at the top of her lungs, crying out that the federal government was going to seize every single asset they owned and auction off their entire lives. She sobbed that the agents had already frozen their bank accounts and locked them out of their retirement funds because of the forged mortgage documents they had foolishly signed. Calvin choked on his tears, begging me to have mercy on them and to spare my brother from a life behind iron bars. He cried that if I did not step in and stop the audit, they would lose everything they had spent decades building and protecting. Brenda looked up at me. Her face twisted in pure terror and wailed that they would be entirely homeless by the end of the week, with nowhere to go and no money to buy food. The irony of their panicked begging was staggering, considering the history they were conveniently ignoring in their moment of terror. I stood there feeling their desperate hands clutching my ankles, and I remembered the day I had begged them for a tiny loan just to keep my first business venture from going under. I had brought them my carefully drafted business plan, proving how hard I was working, and they had laughed directly in my face while sitting in their luxurious dining room. Brenda had told me that giving money to a hopeless failure was a bad investment, and Calvin had sneered that I would be homeless soon anyway because I refused to work a real job like my brother. They had happily watched me struggle eating instant noodles and working 20-hour days while they bought Julian a brand new sports car just for passing a single college class. They had deliberately structured their wealth to ensure I never received a single dime of support, telling all their friends that tough love was the only way to cure my pathetic laziness and lack of talent. Now the very people who had coldly predicted my homelessness and actively cheered for my failure were kneeling in the dirt, weeping about their own impending ruin. They begged me to remember that we were family, and that family always provides shelter in a storm. The sound of their pathetic wailing echoed across the empty parking lot as they continued to pull frantically at my clothes. I stared down at the three of them wallowing in the dirt, and I felt a profound, satisfying sense of absolute closure wash over my entire being. I slowly took a deliberate step backward, physically, tearing my pant legs out of their desperate, grasping hands. Brenda and Calvin slumped forward, gasping for air, as I looked down at them with eyes like frozen glass. I told them in a quiet, steady voice that they were completely wrong about their future and that they needed to stop crying. I informed them flatly that they were not going to be homeless at all. Brenda looked up at me, a tiny glimmer of foolish hope flashing in her tear-filled eyes, thinking I had finally forgiven them and decided to save their estate. That hope died instantly when I told her that the federal government was not taking their precious mansion because my corporate holding company had already legally purchased their defaulted debt from the bank. I smiled coldly and told my weeping parents that I was the sole legal owner of their pristine suburban estate now. I explained that out of the goodness of my heart, I would graciously allow them to stay in the house and rent it back from me at full market value. The utter shock paralyzed them completely, stripping away their ability to speak as I delivered my final absolute condition. I warned them that if they were late on their rent by a single day, I would personally have them evicted and thrown out onto the street. Julian stared up at me from the dirt, his pathetic pleas dying in his throat, as the reality of my absolute control over our parents' survival finally set in. The federal agents had given him enough time to say his goodbyes, but their patience was officially exhausted. They grabbed him by the arms, pulling him roughly to his feet and shoving him toward the back of the waiting, heavily armored police cruiser. The heavy steel doors opened, and he was unceremoniously thrown inside. The flashing lights illuminated the tears streaming down his face, as the reality of his new life behind bars completely crushed him. Across the parking lot, Courtney was sitting in the back of her parents' luxury sedan, her face buried in her hands. Her father slammed the gas pedal, and their car sped away into the night, completely abandoning Julian without a second glance. The pristine, highly curated illusion of the golden child was permanently destroyed and broadcasted for the entire country club to see. News cameras from local stations that had caught wind of the massive federal raid were already arriving at the gates, their bright lights and cell phone flashes capturing every single humiliating second of his downfall. Brenda watched the squad car doors close and let out a visceral, agonizing scream, calling Julian's name over and over again, as if her voice alone could break him out of the steel cage. She turned her head slowly from the departing police vehicle and locked her eyes onto me. The look she gave me was one of pure, unadulterated hatred, a toxic, simmering rage that she had harbored against me since I was a child. But beneath that hatred was absolute paralyzing terror. She wanted to scream at me. She wanted to curse my name and blame me for everything, but she remained utterly paralyzed on the asphalt. She knew with terrifying certainty that her housing, her freedom, and her entire future now rested entirely in my hands. If she uttered a single insult, I would evict her before sunrise, and she knew it. Calvin simply stared at the ground, a hollow broken shell of the arrogant patriarch he used to be. The senior federal agent walked over to me holding a clipboard with a thick stack of evidence chain of custody forms. I did not look down at my parents as I took his pen. I clinically and professionally signed my name on the dotted lines, officially handing over the massive diamond ring, the forged documents, and the offshore tax files to the federal government. The transaction was complete. I handed the clipboard back to the agent and pulled my personal cell phone out of my blazer pocket. Brenda and Calvin watched me with wide, desperate eyes as I opened my contact list. Holding the phone up so they could see exactly what I was doing, I pulled up my mother's number and pressed the permanent block button. I did the exact same thing to my father's contact. I did not say a single word of goodbye. I simply turned on my heel, walked toward my waiting car, and left them kneeling in the dirt, surrounded by the flashing red and blue lights of their own destruction. I walked away from the flashing police lights and the chaotic aftermath of the ruined wedding, leaving the suffocating drama of my past permanently behind me. I flew back to Chicago that very same night, stepping into the quiet, pristine sanctuary of my corporate headquarters. I took the private elevator up to the 40th floor, where my massive corner office overlooked the breathtaking expanse of the city skyline. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind me, sealing out the noise of the world and leaving me in a space that belonged entirely to me. I walked slowly across the polished hardwood floor, my heels clicking rhythmically until I stood before the towering floor-to-ceiling glass windows. The sparkling lights of the city stretched out for miles, reflecting in my calm, dark eyes. I stood there in the absolute silence, waiting for the familiar, heavy sting of guilt or sadness to hit me. Society always dictated that family was blood, and that abandoning blood should tear your soul apart. I waited for the grief of losing my parents and my brother to crush my chest, but the grief never came. There was no sadness, no remorse, and absolutely no guilt. Instead, as I looked out over the glittering urban landscape, I felt a profound, overwhelming wave of absolute peace wash over my entire being. The heavy, suffocating weight that I had carried on my shoulders since childhood, the constant need to prove my worth to people who were determined to misunderstand me, had completely vanished. The toxic infection that had plagued my life, draining my energy and poisoning my self-esteem, had been surgically and permanently removed. I realized that by finally severing the rotting ties that bound me to a family of narcissists and abusers, I had saved my own life. I breathed in the cool, conditioned air of my office, feeling my lungs expand without the crushing pressure of familial obligation. I was no longer the scapegoat, no longer the forgotten daughter, no longer the endless source of funding for a golden child who despised me. I was the architect of my own destiny, standing at the very top of an empire I had built entirely with my own two hands. My mind was clear, and my vision for the future was completely unobstructed by the dark shadows of my former family. The swift and brutal aftermath of the wedding disaster played out exactly as I had calculated. Justice was not just served, it was completely unavoidable. Federal prosecutors moved quickly and aggressively, completely dismantling Julian's fragile web of lies. Without his parents' money to bail him out, and without my identity to hide behind, he crumbled instantly under interrogation. He wept and begged for a plea deal, but the evidence was far too overwhelming. Julian was ultimately sentenced to 7 long, grueling years in a maximum security federal prison for multiple counts of wire fraud and severe identity theft. The golden boy, who had always demanded the finest silk sheets and expensive room service, was now wearing a scratchy orange jumpsuit and eating bland cafeteria slop, surrounded by hardened, violent criminals. His precious high society bride did not stand by him for even a single week. Courtney filed for an expedited divorce the very next morning, legally erasing her brief, humiliating marriage to a convicted felon. Her arrogant, wealthy parents suffered an equally devastating financial downfall. Because they had enthusiastically invested millions into Julian's fraudulent ghost company to hide their own assets from the IRS. Their family wealth was severely crippled when the federal government seized all associated funds during the investigation. They went from hosting extravagant country club galas to desperately downsizing their entire lifestyle to avoid total, absolute bankruptcy. As for Brenda and Calvin, their punishment was exactly what they had earned. Their desperate attempts to secure legal counsel were completely useless because all of their stolen funds had been legally reclaimed. They were allowed to stay in their massive suburban mansion, but the harsh reality of their new arrangement was utterly crushing. Now, in their late 60s, the parents who had brutally mocked my strong work ethic were forced to put on cheap polyester uniforms and work exhausting minimum wage retail jobs. They spent their days standing on their swollen, aching feet, bagging groceries and stocking shelves just to scrape together enough cash to afford the exorbitant monthly rent they now owed directly to my holding company. They knew with absolute terrifying certainty that if they were late on their rent by a single day, I would immediately exercise my legal right to evict them. They were completely trapped in a hell of their own making, forced to serve the very daughter they had treated like garbage for decades. I turned away from the sprawling, magnificent Chicago skyline and walked gracefully toward my massive mahogany desk. I poured myself a generous glass of an incredibly rare, expensive vintage wine, the dark crimson liquid catching the soft, ambient light of the room. I took a slow, deliberate sip, savoring the rich, complex flavor of absolute victory and unbothered success. Setting the crystal glass down, I picked up my sleek silver fountain pen and pulled a thick stack of legal documents toward me. With a few smooth, confident strokes, I signed off on a massive new multi-million-dollar corporate acquisition that would completely double the size of my already formidable empire. I closed the leather-bound folder and smiled, looking back out at the glowing city lights. I was completely free from the toxic ghosts of my past, phenomenally wealthy beyond measure, and surrounded entirely by brilliant, dedicated people who truly respected me. The ultimate lesson learned from this ordeal is that true power never comes from seeking validation from toxic people who are absolutely committed to misunderstanding you. For years, I allowed my abusive family to dictate my worth, serving as nothing more than a disposable stepping stone for their arrogant ambitions. However, their endless cruelty became the exact catalyst that forged my unbreakable independence. I learned that silent, patient preparation is a far deadlier weapon than loud arguments or tearful pleas. When you stop begging abusers for basic respect and focus entirely on building your own untouchable empire, their own arrogant lies will eventually completely destroy them. Blood does not excuse abuse, and biology does not demand endless loyalty. If you have ever had to cut ties with toxic family members to protect your peace, share your story in the comments below, and subscribe for more stories about reclaiming your absolute power.